The following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
My baby dolls, we are past mid-January. Welcome to another episode of Genesis. As always, I am your host, Ian Kahanowitz. I mentioned mid-January because there's only 4.5 weeks left to pitches and catches. And, of course, I live up in the Boston area. And, of course, as all of you know, hey, there's a championship football game at Gillette Stadium. Surprise, surprise, the Patriots, who are 8 minutes from my house because I am in the town over to Foxborough. Hey, Tom Brady wins the MVP. We're going against the Jacksonville Jaguars. Another Super Bowl for Belichick and the boys? Maybe. But then again, I'm not a Patriots fan because I grew up in New York City. I'm a Giants fan. But the rest of my family are Patriots fans, and they, cajole me to watch the games. And, hey, I've been watching Brady for 18 years. But, hey, after this and the Super Bowl, we got the Winter Olympics, pitches and catches, March Madness, and finally, baseball season. And we're bringing back a guest. I love my recurring guests. We got author Martin C. Babicz doing the national pastime, U.S. history through baseball. And for all of you who listen to my shows, basically I have my master's in history. I taught common law for many years. Been a tax lawyer for, God knows how long. And history, baseball, the two go hand in hand. Of course, many of you know there's a niche market for books on baseball, especially historical books. National Pastime is a very good overview of not only the sport itself, but the time periods and what was going on during that period of time in American history. And today we're going to take a look. We're going to start right after the World War I, after the whole Landis, Kennesaw Mountain Landis and the Black Sox scandal. Now baseball is going to change as well as America because we're going to get a new president in. We're going to get Warren Harding in, and I'm not too fond of Harding, but if you look at his record, especially the Teapot Dome scandal, but he did have a decent phrase, normalcy. We're going to get back to normalcy, and that means baseball as well, because the whole sport was overshadowed by the whole Black Sox scandal, saying, well, this is just another reason for betting. It's a betting haven. These games are fixed. We were all betting that everyone's into this pastime, but Babe Ruth's going to arrive, or actually he did arrive, but will send the sport to heights never known before. And we're going to get in to the subject. We're going to get in with Marty in a few more minutes, but of course you are listening to the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network with the Zigzag Man, Ralph Tycho, and boy, lots of shows on. I'm telling you, Golenbach University with renowned author Peter Golenbach. Hey, we got Hal Bach. Hal Bach spoke to Marvin Miller. Well, a lot of times. He covered baseball and football for well over 40 years. He has a show, Vintage Sports. We got Bill Kashadis in Philadelphia. He had Mike Schmidt on his podcast. We have a lot of stuff. We got Nancy Finley, Charlie O's niece. Carl Finley's daughter, well, actually cousin, but she likes to be called, niece. She always refers to Charlie O as Uncle Charlie. But hey, she's doing the A's out in Oakland. Glad to have her on the network. And, of course, we got plenty of other shows. Mark Littell, the guy who served up the ball to Chris Chambliss in the 1976 American League Championship Series. We have Mark in the midday. And, it was Mark Littell's birthday the other day. He turned 65, and I am fortunate to speak to these ex-players, Brett Boone, Bob Boone I speak to. I always tease them about Aaron. Aaron is going to achieve heights that they never did because he's the Yankees manager, my New York Yankees, and, we're giving him a nice team. We're going to see what happens with that, and I'm really excited for baseball season. It's going to get here sooner or later, but, hey, who is Martin Babicz? And, something, you got to go to the Rocky Mountains. Got to start singing old John Denver, Rocky Mountain High, He teaches history at the University of Colorado Boulder for the Seawall Hall History and Cultural Residence Academic Program, the Communications and Society Residential Academic Program, and the History department. Professor Babicz teaches several courses on American history, including America Through Baseball. He is the author of a chapter exploring the historiography of sports and pastimes in the 1920s in a companion to Warren Harding, Calvin Coolidge, and Herbert Hoover. And some folks, being a New Dealer and always intrigued by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and where most of my politics were born in school, learning about the New Deal, its programs, and how he changed America through those programs. When you look back at those three presidents, I'm not very fond of their policies, but I don't have to be. But you know what? Calvin Coolidge, he was a cool guy. He was from Vermont. He was here in Massachusetts. He was a governor, and he put an end to the police strike. And he loved baseball, but he also had some great sayings. And one of them I'm gonna do to open the show. And when he wasn't very talkative as a president, Calvin Coolidge. A lot of the governors used to say, "I can't get my agenda done. I have all these visitors in the governor mansions, and I can't get nothing done." And you know what Cal said to them? You talk back to them. Now, Cal, when a reporter asked him, they said, "Mr. President, don't you think that intelligence is the most important attribute a person could have?" And he looked at her, Calvin Coolidge, and he said, "No. Perseverance is the most important thing. I know a lot of educated idiots." And you got good old Cal, Love the dour face of Cal, but he had a lot of good proverbs that I could cite. But without any further ado, welcome to the show, Marty.
Thank you, Ian. I'm glad to be here. And I share your love for Calvin Coolidge's wit. He was a guy of very few words, but he knew how to use them.
Well, there was another reporter with Cal and said, "Hey, Mr. President, I bet you I can make you say 3 words." And you know what he said to her? You lose. That's it. That's
what I had in my mind when I heard you talking about him. Just like I said, brilliant wit.
Oh, he was fantastic. And you know what? Although he was a very dour president, he did like baseball, and he always used to dress with outfits. Like he would dress up as an old West guy when he used to go to a bullfight or something. He was it's funny, a very conservative man like him would be like Halloween. He would just go out and get dressed. He was a man of many, many differences that I still can't figure out. But anyway, we're going to be figuring out Warren G. Harding. We're going to be figuring out what the heck's going on post-World War I. Why is there a policy called normalcy? What was with the Palmer raids? What was with the Red Scare? What was going on with baseball and the whole Black Sox scandal? And all of a sudden, 1920 comes, and bam, we're into a new decade. New things. Women are getting liberated. They're able to vote. They're able to wear makeup. The whole Victorian age is crashing down. What's going on here, Professor Babicz?
Well, it's very interesting. There's a major change taking place in the United States in the 1920s. And people, for the first time, are starting to think that they're living in something they refer to as modern times. In fact, there was a Charlie Chaplin movie with that name. Automation seems to be taking over. People are starting to accept Charles Darwin's idea of evolution. Women are getting new roles. They're getting the right to vote. All these changes are taking place in society, and so many Americans are thinking things are finally different than they were during the Gilded Age, that this is a whole new society. Urbanization has taken place. The 1920 census was the first census in which a majority of Americans lived in cities and towns. So there's a sense that America is now modern. There were people who didn't like what was happening. In fact, there had been the progressive era, which you mentioned in our last time I was on your program, where there was this idea that the government could improve society through regulation. And then, of course, we had the terrible violence of World War I. And so when Warren Harding ran for president in 1920, his promise was return to normalcy. And actually, that word itself is unusual because that was not a word. And a lot of people thought, wow, this senator from Ohio is very smart. He can make up his own words. And in reality, the speech he had prepared said return to normality. But he misread his speech, and he said normalcy, and suddenly we had a new word. And so he gets elected by a landslide. But the question is, what does the election mean? What is normalcy? Does it mean going back before the turmoil of 1919? And as you mentioned with the Palmer raids and also with the race riots in Chicago, 1919 was a very tumultuous year. So is it going back before that? Is it going back before World War I? Is it going back before the progressive era, which started with Teddy Roosevelt? Well, apparently, the return to normalcy meant going back to the corruption and greed of the Gilded Age. And so during the 1920s, we get bootlegging, we get the Teapot Dome scandal that you mentioned, and so we get this culture of greed and corruption that sort of returns. But we also have this idea, like I said, that times are different, that times are more modern, and not only is society changing, but baseball is changing, because before 1920, the game was played the way Ty Cobb played it. You know, you bunted, you got on base, you would use a hit and run, you would steal a base, you would scrap out a run in a very low-scoring game. And when Babe Ruth appears on the scene, he changes the game by hitting home runs, and suddenly the long ball, scoring runs in bunches, changes the game of baseball. So just as America is modernizing in the 1920s, so is baseball. But also, just like America is sort of mired in this culture of greed and corruption, so is baseball with the Black Sox scandal of 1919. At a time where there's the Teapot Dome scandal, where there's the Fatty Arbuckle scandal, where there's bootlegging, baseball also faces its greatest scandal of its history.
Hey, you know what's interesting? Because not a lot of people know about this time period. And if you look at the 1920 election, the Treaty of Versailles was unpopular with a lot of people here in the United States. We have just gone through a First World War. We're still getting involved in European politics here. We're trying to police the world. That wasn't a very good thing for a lot, and it caused a huge reaction against Wilson and the Democrats. And the problem is, what's funny about the election? A lot of people don't know this. You had the senator from Ohio in Warren Harding as the Republican candidate, and you had the governor of Ohio in James Cox.
Right.
As Democrats. It was a battle for Ohio. Of course, not a lot of people know Franklin Roosevelt was picked for the vice president candidacy. He could walk in those years before polio. And, of course, you had good old Calvin Coolidge as the vice president. Now, the problem is normalcy conflicted and contrasted with the popular sentiment of we're a modern country because, like you said, where are we returning to? You're going to go back to the Gilded Age? You're going to go back to the Civil War? That wasn't modern. People were still divided. You still had segregation. You still had Reconstruction. You still had a Civil War. So it even has to go back to before then. But even before then, what did you have? You had Manifest Destiny, looking for extra land, moving west, having a Mexican War, being deeply divided amongst the northern and southern societies where fights were common, in Congress where actually fistfights broke out. I forgot the senator. Who was the senator? Charles
Sumner of Massachusetts.
Yeah, he was caned.
Hit with a cane by a congressman from South Carolina named Prescott Brooks.
Yeah, he was it's amazing. So what's normalcy? Normalcy was for the period of time. And let me ask you this, like I ask a lot of people who write about the era. The ball became a little livelier, a lot livelier. I think Ruth hit, 59 home runs that year? No one ever hit that many home runs. People who I've had on my show wrote books about the period. They cannot place the fact that the ball changed, which it didn't, there was other popular sentiments. Choking up on the bat was done away with. Now that's holding the bat differently. Everything from putting a cork into the ball to, just the way the rules, you can't scuff the balls anymore. You can't throw a spitball. What do you say about the live ball era, the transition from dead ball?
A lot of those things, had some influence. I mentioned a few minutes ago about businesses starting to use automation in the spirit of being more efficient. Well, around this time, they start to use automation to wind the yarn around the ball rather than have it wound by hand. And so if a machine is winding the yarn, it's a little tighter, which means the ball probably travels a little farther. They're also using better quality material. They're using Australian wool. So this may have some effect. The rule changes, which were all sparked by the death of Ray Chapman, who was hit in the head by a pitch thrown by Carl May of the Yankees, that made baseball think, wait a minute, we have to make these baseballs easier for players to see. We have to make it easier for them to predict where the ball's going to cross the plate. So they banned scuffing, they banned spitballs, they made umpires replace the baseball if it got dirty. That helps the batter. But then there's also just this cultural change where the batters are starting to intentionally hit home runs. And there's that story of Ty Cobb, who hated the change in the strategy of baseball. And one day he called the reporters around. He said, look, I'm going to show you something today. Today I'm going to go for home runs. And that day in a game against the Browns, Ty Cobb hit 3 home runs. And then he said to the reporters after the game, see, it's not hard. But after that, he went back to his normal strategy of just getting on base. So the fact that more players are changing the way they're approaching the game and swinging for the fences, all of this, leads to this change in the game where baseball becomes a game of the big inning.
Just like America is changing into the modern era, we got baseball changing as well. And I think a perfect example of this lies with John McGraw and the Giants. Because, again, king of the dead ball era, even before the dead ball era, he played for the Baltimore Orioles. His strategy is still the same in basically 1921, 22, and 23. He wins the World Series in 21 and 22, beating the Yankees both times. 23, the Yankees finally get to him. And that is when I believe the live ball overtakes the dead ball in strategy and the way the game is played during that series, because after that, McGraw would not see another World Series and would be replaced in 1932. 33, the Giants would win the championship, but McGraw by that time was sick and ended up passing away by that time anyway. But the whole change.
Yeah, I think in 24, McGraw and the Giants lost the series to the Senators, too, though.
They did. Yeah, they did. Yeah. They did. And, of course, Connie Mack took a long time to really hone in on it because, again, what was going on in 1914, there was a fire sale in Philadelphia. Again, the Federal League was buying up good players. Mack knew he couldn't afford all this stuff, and he got rid of anything. But by the end of the 1920s, a lot of people, we think today, Boston Red Sox, New York Yankees, San Francisco Giants, LA Dodgers, the Philadelphia A's, and the New York Yankees from 1926 through 1931, I think were two of the best teams of all times, especially the 29 Athletics and the 27 Yankees with Murderers Row, and we'll get to that in a little bit. But speaking of modern age, hey, we got the invention of radio, and now let me ask you this. Different parts of the country are embracing the whole radio ideology. Some of the owners aren't keen on this new technology. What's going on here?
Yeah, there was the fear among some owners in baseball that if you put the game on the radio, people won't go to the ballpark. They'll stay home and listen to the game on the radio. So the owner of the Browns, a guy named Phil Ball, tried to get Major League Baseball to agree to stay off the radio. But in Chicago, the guy who owned the Cubs, William Wrigley, decides he's going to put the Cubs on the radio, and he discovered radio had the opposite impact, that people listened to the game on the radio, but it made them more excited about baseball, so that when you could go to a game, you were more likely to go to a game because you were all enthusiastic because you had been listening to the games on the radio. So Wrigley discovered the radio was actually making people more excited about baseball, but it took a long time for other people to realize that. Into the late 30s, the three baseball teams in New York City all were afraid of the radio, and they had an agreement that they would stay off the radio, even for their road games, because when one team in New York is on the road, another team in New York is playing at home, and the fear was if the games were on the radio, fans wouldn't go to the game, they'd listen to the radio. But finally, when Larry McPhail becomes the president and general manager of the Brooklyn Dodgers, he pulls the Dodgers out of that agreement, and he puts the Dodgers on the radio. He brings over Red Barber to do the broadcasting, and suddenly he's got a huge hit. People all over the New York area are listening to the Dodgers on the radio, and this not only is one of the things that made the Dodgers the leading team of the National League, but it gave them a jump over both the Yankees and the Giants because they were on the radio first.
That's right. And, I know all of the Midwest embraced it. St. Louis, like you mentioned, Wrigley did so. It was big in the Midwest, but again, the reluctancy in the East, again, gatekeeping receipts for the king. That's how their revenues work. But now let me ask you this. Now people aren't going to the ballpark anymore just by train or trolley or walking. They got the automobile now, and that's posing a problem as well. Where the hell to park?
Exactly, and that's still a problem at some places. There's no parking around Fenway Park, and I haven't been to Yankee Stadium in about 20 years because I don't live back east anymore, but the last time I went to Yankee Stadium, I drove, and normally I didn't drive, but I was taking my family to the game, and they weren't from back east, so they'd never been there before, and it took me almost 2 hours just to get out of the parking garage when the game was over. So the stadiums in the first half of the 20th century were built in downtown neighborhoods, often in residential neighborhoods, squeezed between buildings and roads, and there was no thought about the automobile because when these stadiums were built in the 19-teens or just before the 19-teens, the automobile still wasn't that big, and people took the streetcar, the trolley, the subway, or they walked to the ballpark. But by the second half of the 20th century, by the 1950s, this is a real problem. People are moving to the suburbs after World War II. They're becoming more and more reliant on the automobile. And so if they're going to go to a ball game, they're going to drive into the city to go to the game. But where do you park? And this will really become a drag on baseball attendance in the 1950s. And the first solution that's adopted in the 1960s is baseball teams start building ballparks in suburban areas outside of the city. I mean, the Mets built their stadium in Flushing Meadows, which is where Robert Moses wanted the Brooklyn Dodgers to move. The Minnesota Twins built their stadium in Bloomington, Minnesota. In Houston, Colt Stadium and later the Astrodome were built in a suburban area called the Medical Center District. And, of course, the biggest example is the Angels built their stadium not in Los Angeles, but in Anaheim in Orange County, near Disneyland. So, and I know I'm getting way beyond the time period you wanted to talk about today, but that's the reaction to the fact that America has fallen in love with the automobile, and there really is no parking in downtown areas.
But and you do mention later on, 30 years later, but that's one of the reasons why that Walter O'Malley left Brooklyn. There was no longer the park. And when he went to California and Los Angeles, he was going to build a ballpark that was only for baseball and would be accessible to hold the massive amount of cars that would be driven there. And, of course, he had a huge fight with the Chavez Ravine spot for many years. They didn't even know if they were going to be playing, but that's a whole legal thing we can get down the road. In the meantime, we have something very interesting here before I even get to Branch Rickey and the invention of the minor league system, because clubs just couldn't keep up with the Yankees and Rupert and the spending and all that stuff. Ronald Reagan. I keep forgetting about this. Let's talk about radio for a little bit. In the 1930s, we think of radio play-by-play. We think about it if you're old enough, and I think you and I are, to remember the transistor radios at the beach, no matter what part.
Oh, I remember bringing this transistor radio to school during the World Series because when I was in grade school, the World Series was played during the daytime, and you bring a little transistor radio and a little earphone, and you try to sneak it in and listen to the World Series during class. And if you had a cool teacher and she realized you were doing that, she'd say, take off the earphone and turn it up so we could all listen.
Yeah, that's right. That is true because, that's how it was. I mean, I remember as a little boy, the 74 World Series between Oakland and the Dodgers, and they were played during the day in the afternoon, just like the championship, the division series on now. I think it was 75 between the Red Sox and the Cincinnati Reds. The first prime time World Series actually took place, and after that, it's always been prime time. But
I think it was a transition. I think they started by doing weekend games still in the day and doing the weekday games at night. And I think that might have been a few years earlier, but by the middle 70s, even the weekend games are at night now. So I think you're right about 75 being all at night.
And I remember that. I remember always saying to my father, why is World Series, why is Joe Rudy making this fantastic catch in the sunlight out? I don't understand this.
Mm-hmm.
Today it's almost like, but we had recreations. Baseball got so popular. We think of sitting on a beach listening to Ernie Harwell if you're in Detroit, or hearing, Phil Rizzuto or Bill White in my time, or Mel Allen on the radio, Red Barber, whoever it was, Jack Buck, whatever it was, the transistor radio was our internet back then. Loved it, but you had these recreations in the 1930s. They didn't actually televise or live games. Ronald Reagan was one of these recreations. They read from a script. What's going on here?
Okay, yeah, this was something, especially in minor league cities or smaller cities, where they didn't have the facilities to broadcast live. And so they would have a broadcaster in a studio. They would give him a script from a game that took place a few hours earlier, and he would, read from the play-by-play and pretend he was calling the game as it was happening. And he had all sorts of sound effects, a couple pieces of wood to make it sound like the baseball hitting a bat. He had a recording of crowd noises to make it sound like the roar of the crowd. Some of them even had recordings of vendors selling peanuts or hot dogs or beer, so that it really sounded like you were at a ball game. And this was something that was more common in smaller places where there wasn't the facility to broadcast live. Because actually, live baseball on the radio, the 1921 World Series was broadcast live from the Polo Grounds, but it was done in a weird way, again, because they didn't have the facilities they have now. They sent a sports writer to the Polo Grounds, put him on the telephone, and they put him on the phone to a studio in Newark. And they had the broadcaster in Newark on the air, and the sports writer would tell the broadcaster what was happening, and the broadcaster would relay that over the radio. So that was going on, but Ronald Reagan, like you said, in Des Moines, Iowa, was rebroadcasting or recreating games that had already taken place on the radio so that people could hear this. And the interesting thing for me, when I was in high school in the mid-1970s, public radio was recreating some major league games, not because they needed to, because obviously by then there was live broadcast and there was even television, but just for the appeal of what it used to sound like. And so that was sort of neat to be able to hear these guys in the 1970s recreate games the way some broadcasters did in the 20s and 30s.
Yeah, I do remember a few of them, I believe, especially on the Mets side, not so much on the Yankee side because the Yankees had all the money, but I do recall that those were taped, recorded, and a lot of it, especially Kiner's Corner, after every Mets game in New York, they would broadcast it later on at night as well, if you didn't catch it in the afternoon. But Brad Trickey, guy's 20 years ahead of his time. What's going on there?
Yeah, I mean, he's ahead of his time in terms of baseball, but he's fits perfectly into his time, into this concept of the 1920s being modern times. Because as I mentioned at the beginning of your show, there's this idea that America is different, that America is more modern, and businesses are relying on automation. Businesses are adopting this idea of scientific management, how to be more efficient, how to be more productive, which in turn would make the company more profitable. And I mentioned how the baseball is being made by machine in the 1920s. Well, the biggest cost for Major League Baseball teams was players and where to find these players. And if you found a young prospect who was really good, the danger was the Yankees would find him too, and they would offer more money, and they would sign this guy. So Branch Rickey sort of epitomizes this idea of scientific management of business when he invents the farm system. He starts to buy up some minor league baseball teams. He buys up a team at Fort Smith, Arkansas. He buys up a team in Syracuse, and he comes up with this idea, let's sign whoever we can at very low prices and stock these minor league teams, and we'll train these players, and if they improve, we'll promote them up the chain, and they don't have to pay them a lot because with the reserve clause, once you get them under contract, you pretty much control what they're going to be paid for the rest of their career. So sign these players, promote them up the farm system as they get better, and then when they're ready to join the major leagues, they could join the Cardinals, and suddenly St. Louis has this huge stream of players coming to the team. And this means a couple of things. Not only do they have access to new players, but that means they have surplus players that they could trade away, or even players on the Cardinals who are established but getting older. They could sell those players because teams will pay money for well-known players, especially, if the fans recognize the name, and the Cardinals are willing to sell players who are well-known because they know that in the wings, in their farm system, there's a guy who could step in and take over for them. So Branch Rickey sort of modernizes the way baseball players are recruited to the major league teams. And this will give the Cardinals a huge jump. They will win several pennants in the 1920s and 1930s with this new paradigm on how they're recruiting players.
It was good for the time period, but the drawback to that was you saturate your minor leagues with all these players. The problem is for the actual players themselves, they might never see Major League Baseball because there's always someone better than them.
That's true, and also it's going to be one of the reasons the number of minor league teams will diminish, because once the farm system takes hold, virtually every minor league baseball player is under contract with a major league team, whereas before Branch Rickey did this, minor league teams were independent, and so they would seek their own players, and of course they would sell them to better teams when if another team discovered them. But now that the players' salaries are being paid by the major league teams, there's far fewer minor league players, so there's far fewer minor league teams than there were, say, before 1940.
And you know what's funny? The thing is, when baseball cards became popular in the 1950s, Topps baseball card company saw the minor leagues as their way to bypass the major leagues in the form of paying these players for their baseball card. Now, what their strategy was, and when Marvin Miller came in 1966, there was plenty of minor league teams. You still had Negro League teams, which I think we're going to get to the next time. We probably won't have time today because I still got a lot to go with in the 1920s. But the thing that I'm trying to say is like, look, they'll pay you $50 a year as a minor league baseball player where you get nothing. And should you make it to the major leagues, Topps is going to be getting all this money for your baseball card, and they're only paying you $50 a year. And these people were contracted for life because all these minor leaguers thought, hey, my picture's on a bubblegum card. This is fantastic, which they didn't realize the business side of it, that, look, you're only getting a couple of pennies out of the millions of dollars that Topps is exploiting off of you. And that's what the minor leagues brought as well later on.
I didn't realize that. So it's almost like there was a reserve clause for baseball cards as well.
There was. Again, and when Miller came in the first year in 1966, he saw the contract and he almost threw up, but he used an old trick from the 1950s with, I believe it was Post, the company. They would use a player's image, but they would airbrush the name of the hats out. And I saw that in the 1970s because the owners didn't want to say, hey, we own the uniforms, we own the clubs, you're not going to use that. And Miller said, fine, we'll just airbrush it. And cut a deal with Coca-Cola. On the inside of the bottle caps would be the players' faces with their uniform with all the names brushed out, and it made Coca-Cola even bigger in the mid-1960s and brought in a revenue of $340,000 in the first 6 months for the Major League Baseball Players Association because he had to go around the Topps deal.
Yeah, and you still see that today. You'll see advertisers that'll have athletes doing commercials, and I guess it depends on what kind of arrangement they work out with the club, because sometimes the athlete will be wearing his uniform, sometimes he'll be wearing a uniform that's the same color, but you won't see the logo on the uniform or the name on the uniform, and that's because the advertiser doesn't want to pay the club for the right to use the logo, but you'll still get the athlete in the commercial.
That's right. Here's an interesting thing, and again, you're talking right up my alley because, again, you go onto Facebook. If you're on Facebook, you can go to my Ty Cobb in the dead ball area. You can go to my Negro League sites. You can go to my broadcasting baseball sites. And you can go to my Women in History Baseball League site. And, again, you mentioned the Flappers in the 1920s, but you also mentioned the Bloomer Girls and all the girls prior to the 1943 Women's League of America during the war. A lot of women baseball around this time, is there not?
Yes, there is. In fact, there's a couple of professional women's teams that are competing as independent teams. There's a team in New York and a team in Philadelphia, and the team from Philadelphia went to play in Japan, and it was really sort of tragic. These were basically teenage girls, maybe 16, 17, 18, 19 years old. And when they get to Japan, they're heralded as a great women's team, and they're playing men's teams. And they're not doing so well. And as the word spreads that these women aren't playing as well as the men, attendance starts to decline, and people stop going to the game. And when the trip is over, the women didn't earn enough money to pay for their tickets back to the United States. And so an English benefactor living in Japan donated money to buy tickets, and most of the team sailed back to the U.S., but a few women weren't able to make that voyage, and so 3 of the women sail a few months later, and tragedy struck as the ship hit a storm in the Pacific, and after the storm calmed down, one of the women, a woman named Leona Kearns, went on deck for some fresh air. She probably was a bit seasick from the storm. And then a rogue wave came and washed her overboard, and she was never seen again. So it was sort of a tragedy. But the point was there were these women teams sort of, playing baseball, and they were interested in the game, and there was enough interest to at least sustain these teams, perhaps not on international tours as this one turned out, but at least to keep these teams going for a while in the 1920s.
A few baseball players who played in the major leagues also were on the Bloomer Girls. I think Smokey Joe Wood, he got a start in 1908 with the Bloomer Girls, and a few others. I think Honus Wagner, but I'm not sure. Rogers Hornsby, one of the two. They got their start with the Bloomer Girls, and they usually had 2 or 3 men on the team. If you want a good book on the Bloomer Girls, get Deborah Shattuck's book. The Bloomer Girls was published last year, and she was on my show, and I have the book, and it shows women going back to playing baseball right from its inception. Very important part of history. I'm glad that you put it in your book. Not a lot of people do. But here's something that's really going on in America, and it had been since the end of the Civil War, died down a bit. Then in 1915, you had a movie, D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation, and here we come with the reinvention of the Ku Klux Klan. What's going on here?
Yeah, again, this is a part of what's happening in America in the 1920s, or at least this period from World War I onward. The Klan was originally set up after the Civil War to keep African Americans, former slaves, from voting, to sort of intimidate them and scare them into not voting. But in 1920, there's a backlash, around the time of the 20s, there's this backlash to America becoming modern times. And the people who are most afraid of this are rural Protestant white men who are sort of threatened by the rise of immigrant groups, threatened by the changing role of women, threatened by the immigrant groups being both Catholic or Jewish, and still threatened by African Americans. And so we see this increase in the number of people joining the Klan. I think membership in the Klan rose to about 3 million people in the 1920s. And so we've got this increase in this group, and it's a racist group, but it's also an anti-immigrant group, an anti-Jewish group, an anti-Catholic group, an anti-women's group, and a related movement that's going on, because again, more and more people are accepting evolution as an explanation for the origin of the species. We get fundamentalists in many rural states passing laws banning the teaching of evolution in schools. And, of course, in Tennessee, John Scopes, a science teacher, agrees to challenge the law, and he's arrested, and we get the Scopes trial in 1926. So what we're having is a conflict between people who are looking at America in modern times and other people who want to go back before the modern times. And we see the same conflict take place in baseball, but over a different issue. The issue in baseball is, should baseball be played on Sundays? The same people who opposed evolution were the people who opposed Sunday baseball. They thought Sunday was the Sabbath and that people should just look at it as a day of rest. Other people, including Catholic priests and mainstream Protestant ministers, said, no, baseball is a wholesome activity for the whole family. I'd rather see people go to ball games than see them go to bars and get drunk. And so we get other people who support the idea of Sunday baseball, and this really becomes a battleground in the 1920s and early 30s. And by the middle of the 20s, there's 3 states left that ban Sunday baseball: Massachusetts, New York, and Pennsylvania. New York finally legalizes it, although the Brooklyn Dodgers sort of pushed the envelope by scheduling their home opener on Easter Sunday, which didn't go over very well. Pennsylvania, they finally agree to change the law when both the Phillies and the Athletics threatened to move to Camden, New Jersey. And with the thought of losing 2 major league teams, Pennsylvania finally changed the law. And I think in 1929, Massachusetts changed the law because the state had a budget deficit, and they looked for some way to close the deficit. And they came up with this idea, well, let's give the Red Sox and the Braves the opportunity to play baseball on Sunday if they're willing to pay a license fee. And that license fee would be enough to bridge the state deficit. So finally we get Sunday baseball becoming universal. But it was the major battleground between traditionalist and modernist in baseball, just like evolution was the major battleground in other parts of American society.
And it was, and it goes back to the 1870s because some cities allowed it, other cities didn't, but for the most part it didn't because, again, you got Scopes Monkey, you got evolution. It's trying to break up the old order. You got women now like flappers, and now they wear makeup and they're donning. They're not staying home. They're going out and dancing and boozing and all this stuff. Sunday baseball was a hot topic in the courts, which, again, in the courts in the 1880s, they allowed some of these communities to play baseball on Sunday. But for the most part, that was a hot topic of trying to get baseball into the modern era, especially on a Sunday, which was reserved for Christian nation, especially the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. And, Ku Klux Klan really had their pulse on it. Again, if you ever see their March of Washington, I think in 1923 or 24, they're holding signs with KKK, but they put, like you mentioned, no kikes for Jews, no Catholics with a K for the Catholics, because they didn't like the Pope, and no coons for black people. And their influence would last well into the 1960s, even in the 70s when I was a little kid. But the big thing that came out of this was that Hugo Black, who was put onto the Supreme Court in 1937 by Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He became one of the most liberal justices we had. But even he said at his hearings, you had to be into the Klan in the South if you were going to be in politics or law. And he wasn't both. So that's how prevalent the Klan was for that.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you mentioned Sunday baseball going back to the 19th century, very true. And when people look at the Cincinnati Reds were kicked out of the National League after the 1880 season for playing games on Sunday, or at least allowing their ballpark to be used by other teams on Sunday, we get the formation of the American Association in 1882, which allowed Sunday baseball. But what people don't realize, of the teams in the American Association, only Cincinnati and St. Louis had local laws that allowed Sunday baseball. So those teams were playing baseball on Sunday, but the rest of that league wasn't, because they were located in communities where Sunday baseball was prohibited. And finally, during World War I, we get sort of a crack in the armor, because Major League Baseball is looking for some way to get the rules changed to allow Sunday baseball. So they start scheduling benefit games to raise money for the war. And they're exhibition games, and the ticket sales do not go to the club. They're all going to the war effort. So that gets them around the rule, because the rule prohibited professional games. But their hope was, we get people used to going to games on Sunday. It'll make it easier to change the law. And sure enough, once the war's over, we start to see the prohibitions in most cities disappear immediately. Like I said, Massachusetts, New York, and Pennsylvania were the last holdouts.
Yeah, that's right. And again, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, big Catholic communities, big community with priests. But I'm gonna finish the 20s with you regarding this. The Nickelodeons of the 1910s really turned into a whole industry by the time the 20s came around. And you can't find this anywhere on DVD. It used to be on VHS, if you want to go back that far. And I remember watching it on TV in the late 70s, early 80s, Hollywood, The Silent Years, and it was narrated by James Mason. It was a 14-part episode about, all the films, comedies and war films and big spectacles like Ben-Hur in the 1920s and the Ten Commandments by Cecil B. DeMille. And, they did make a movie, Sunset Boulevard, later on in 1950, where Gloria Swanson basically is playing herself, a washed-up, silent movie starlet who's trying to get back some sort of fame. But you make a great dichotomy here. The lifestyle between Fatty Arbuckles and Babe Ruth. And I thought that was a beautiful analogy. Let's explain this.
Yeah, Fatty Arbuckle was a very popular silent film actor. He was a comedian. He had a large following, and it's not unusual in Hollywood even today, or other areas where there's celebrities with a lot of money. He'd throw wild parties. And at a wild party that he threw in San Francisco in the early 20s, a young actress named Virginia Rapp collapsed and died. And she died from a ruptured kidney. She did have some intestinal problems all her life. And Fatty Arbuckle weighed over 300 pounds. So in the mind of the public, she must have been killed, because Fatty Arbuckle must have tried to rape her and crush her to death. So he's arrested for manslaughter, and he's put on trial, and he's tried 3 times. The first 2 trials ended in hung juries. And finally, he's acquitted But it was the trial captured the attention of the country. The whole country was fixated at it. The whole country just assumed he was guilty, and so the whole country's paying attention to these trials. And once he was acquitted, it was like the O.J. Simpson trial, where O.J. Simpson was acquitted, but in the public's mind, the guy was guilty. And the same thing happened with Fatty Arbuckle, that the public just assumed this guy must have been guilty, even if he was acquitted, and so his career's over. Nobody's going to want to hire this guy and put him in a movie if he killed a woman by trying to rape her. And so, the newspapers of the 1920s were obsessed with celebrities, and they loved printing all the scandals, except when it came to Babe Ruth. They wouldn't print scandals about Babe Ruth. They would print stories about Babe Ruth going to the hospitals and visiting sick kids. They were determined to always show Babe Ruth in a good light and not to drag his reputation through the mud like the newspapers did with Fatty Arbuckle.
And, like you mentioned in your book, the 1925 season was one of Ruth's worst. That whole bellyache, scandal and stuff. And I do agree with you. I think the partying caught up with him in 1925. He was about 30 years old at the time, and I do believe he had some kind of sexually transmitted disease, which caused him to falter on the field. He would rebound, but I think it was the bellyache heard around the world, if I'm not mistaken.
That's what the newspapers called it. They claimed he ate too many hot dogs before a game.
Yeah, and I always have this discussion with people who are so against, people who used steroids in the 90s and early 2000s, that they should never be in the Hall of Fame. And I said, well, look, they didn't break any law, okay? There are 5,000 steroids. I said, look, it wasn't until the late 90s when you had McGuire and Sosa hitting it that people started to notice, and then they banned it, but they all said it's cheating. It goes back even further. It goes back, I speak to the players in the 1970s, and they use greenies or uppers, and it goes back to the 1940s where Ted Williams was using a purple drink to try to give him more stamina. I said, why wouldn't you use these things if it's going to be making you stronger, faster, better? It's like the $6 Million Man. I said, Babe Ruth broke every record known to mankind in baseball. And he thumbed his nose against prohibition. The guy drank when booze was illegal, and he got in.
Yeah, and like you said, Mickey Mantle, according to many reports, was taking amphetamines or greenies when he was playing baseball. Where do you draw the line?
You don't. That comes to a board of people who are so blindsided they won't put Gil Hodges in. I speak to Gil's children every day. They won't put Marvin Miller in. They're just so blindsided and only keen on today's stories that they forget about the heroes of yesteryear, like Babe Ruth, who loved children, was great with the media, but was a terrible individual, cheated on his wives, and by the end, when he was 53 years old and he had cancer, he looked like an old man well into his 80s. He could hardly stand up, lost all that weight, he had gray hair, and he passed away from that kind of lifestyle that he lived in the 1920s. And a lot of them did that. So
sure.
It's a very interesting thing. Hey, it's 2 o'clock, and like I said to you, we don't get through these things very quickly. I can make a whole show out of one chapter for each chapters of your book.
Well, this was a very fast hour, Ian. It was enjoyable to talk to you about baseball in the 1920s and American history in the 1920s.
Yeah, and they're both very important, and not a lot of people, like I always say, know about it. That's why I do the podcast. That's why I get you folks back on my show, because you've written something. Maybe not everyone wants to read. They want to skim your book or whatever. I always tell people, I get these authors on my show. Any of these authors who come on my show, I've read their book. I've gone through their book. It's worth buying. It's worth sitting on your shelf. If you don't want it on your shelf, donate it to a library. It's that important. Also, we got some good news with the book regarding the Seymour Medal, the award. I want you to tell people regarding that.
Okay, well, the publisher nominated the book for the Harold and Dorothy Seymour Award, which is a medal given by the Society of American Baseball Research for the best book on baseball history for the year. I have no idea if the book is even a contender for the award. I just feel grateful that the publisher thinks it's good enough to be nominated for the award. So that's all I know right now is the publisher had nominated it for this award, and I don't even know how many nominees there are. There could be dozens, but it's just sort of cool to know that at least the publisher thinks the book is good enough to be up for this award.
It certainly is. I know you've interviewed with other people as well regarding it, but I always do things a lot different than the normal mainstay. I like to always pose some good questions to the authors, let them think outside the box from just what was written, because I know it's been edited. But hey, I always have a good time with you, Marty. Hang on, let me shut the show, talk to you for about a minute afterwards, and then I got to go cook some soup for dinner for my kids who are coming home from school in an hour, and of course my wife after she comes back from work. See, that's what a big lawyer does. He sits at home and he's a house husband and does radio shows and writes books. So hang on a second. It was great having you on the show. Glad you liked it, folks. Can't stress this book enough. National pastime, U.S. history through baseball. You like history, you like baseball. It's in the book. It's not hard reading, very enjoyable. You know, the good thing about Martin and his co-author Thomas Eiler, they don't, go into, boring things, all these things that you really have to read carefully because it is part of the game. It's part of American history, coincides with the times. I implore all of you to go out, get it. Valentine's Day is coming up. I'll give it a plug for all you ladies listening to the show. Go out, get it for the people you love, men you love, even the women you love. I don't know. And these days you can't be too sure. Go get the book. I'm Ian Kahanowitz. As always, we're on the Comfortably Zone Radio Network. And in my favorite broadcasters' words, in the immortal words of my boy, and again, you can't really end the show without Edward R. Murrow. I mean, the guy was in the bombings, for God's sakes, of Britain during the Blitz, an American reporter out in Britain. And, of course, during the 1950s, he was instrumental giving the news, and then he went on to having his own talk shows with famous people. But I love his final sayings, just like I love Calvin Coolidge, and I always on my show, as you folks know. Good night, folks, and good luck.